Today we're on Randall's Ward's Island to meet some friends. Today we're talking about Congress. What do you need to know about Congress? 1. Congress has two houses, or parts. It has the Senate, which is the upper house, and the House, the lower house. The House of Representatives, the lower house, has 435 voting members and 6 non-voting members, but we don't have to worry about them. The upper house, the Senate, has 100 voting members. Now, why split Congress up into two houses? Well, there are a number of reasons. 1, it's a further separation of powers. Remember from Federalist 10 that James Madison and the other founders loved the idea of separating government powers into different bodies. So, Congress, we know, is intended to be the most powerful branch. What if we can split it up even further than we already have? But it's not just separation of powers. For one, the two houses of Congress act as a compromise between the large states and the small states. Back when the representatives to the Constitutional Congress were debating how they wanted the Constitution to be set up, they thought that the major difference in the United States would be between large states and small states. Now, we know today that didn't really pan out. There's no great conflict between Texas and Wyoming or Vermont and California. There's just not any governmental friction there. But at the time, the founders were absolutely convinced that conflict between large states and small states would be the major political tension that the Constitution would have to resolve. And so, the Senate and the House are a compromise. The House is proportional by representation, which means that large states have an advantage in the House. California has 50-something members. Alaska has 1. But in the Senate, Alaska has 2 senators and California has 2 senators. In the Senate, every single state, whether they have a population of 4 or a population of 400 million, gets 2 senators. Doesn't matter. So the Senate is perfectly split between all of the states. Now, this is functionally an advantage for the small states. It means that they get the same representation as states that are 10 or 100 times larger than they are. The other reason that the Congress is split into 2 separate houses is that the House, that is the one that's proportional to the state's populations with 400 members, is considered the lower house that's more susceptible to popular passions. That is, it's the more democratic one. It's the one where people's voices are heard more directly. The Senate, by contrast, is considered this more reserved upper house, where the popular passions of the lower house can cool. Senators who are more insulated from the people they represent can make slightly more reserved or considered judgments. Now, to understand this, you have to know that the Senate was not originally popularly elected. Yes, that's right. People did not actually vote for their senators until a later amendment to the Constitution made it possible to do so. So the idea was that the House would be controlled by the popular passions of the people. It would be democratic. It would change a lot year to year. And indeed, House members are elected every 2 years. The Senate, on the other hand, those senators are only elected every 6 years, would be more reserved. It would be a check on popular passions. So that's why there's 2 houses to the Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, the 2 do have slightly different powers. They're like 90% the same, but some important differences include the fact that all spending bills must originate in the House of Representatives. The Senate has the ability to give advice and consent on Supreme Court justices. That means that they have to approve the justices for the federal court that are selected by the president. You may have seen this mentioned on the news recently with the death of Justice Ginsburg of the Supreme Court. So that's the basic explanation of why the Congress is bicameral. Bicameral just means it has 2 parts, 2 houses in this case. Now, this invites a very central and famous question in political science. How does a bill become a law? A bill is just a draft of a law. And so how do you go from that draft into an actual law on the books?
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. How I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Step one is lobbyists write the bill. Now, you may have been expecting me to say lawmakers write the bill. It's their job description after all. But actually, that's not what happens 9 times out of 10. 9 times out of 10, lobbyists, who are people who are paid to represent specific interests on Capitol Hill, will actually write the bill. The second step is that those lawmakers will introduce the bill to Congress or to the Senate. This process happens in parallel in both the House and the Senate. When you introduce a bill, you get the bill from the lobbyists, and they say, look, we're lobbyists from the paint industry. We think this bill about paint would make a really great law, and so we think you should introduce it. Also, we gave $8,000 to your re-election campaign last cycle, and it would be a shame for that money to just disappear. So it's not always that corrupt, but sometimes it is. And the lawmakers say, okay, fine, we think this bill about paint is a really good idea, And so then they will bring it forward and introduce it. And then it goes into what are called committees. Both the House and the Senate are broken up into a series of committees. So this would be, the Committee on Industrial Manufacturing, maybe. That's where the paint bill would go. I don't actually know. That's not a real committee. I just made it up. After the bill is introduced in committee, the committee can then hold hearings on the bill. Often these hearings involve calling expert witnesses to give their opinion on this bill. And then after hearing these expert witnesses and debating, Congress will mark up the bill. That means they'll make basic edits to the bill. So you imagine a bunch of people in a Google Doc changing things around. So after they get done having all their hearings and people mark up the bill, they have a vote to see whether or not they can pass the bill out of committee. And remember, committees are a lot smaller than the whole body. So the committee could be 11 people or something. So they'll have the vote and say, it passes 9-2 out of committee. Now, to be clear, most bills die long before this process. Most don't even get written up as laws that ever get introduced into a committee, and those that do get introduced into committee die in committee. They never make it out of committee. But if you are that lucky bill that gets voted out of committee, then you will go to a floor vote. this is when the whole body votes on you. So all 435 members of the House of Representatives or 100 members of the Senate will get out their little clickers and they will vote yes or no on that bill. Now, after both bodies have passed the bill in a floor vote, so remember, both the Senate and the House have to pass this bill, there will often be minor differences between the two versions of the bill, the Senate version and the House version. So you have to reconcile those differences. Look at that. I don't even know where this came from. So then you have the process of reconciliation, where the Senate version and the House version have to reconcile their differences between the two versions of that bill. What are they watching? Are they watching the playoffs? Top View Sightseeing. Brought to you by our channel sponsor, Top View Sightseeing. Use promo code The Congress is split into 2 bicameral branches for 10% off your first purchase. After the House and Senate reconcile their 2 slightly different versions of the bill, finally you have this final version. That final version, if passed by both the House and Senate, goes to the president's desk for his signature. The president can choose not to sign the bill, in which case he would veto it, and it would get sent back to the House and Senate. Now, the House and Senate can override his veto with a 2/3 majority vote, but it is really, really hard to get this, and so an overridden veto is incredibly rare in American politics. Generally, if the president wants to veto a bill, he will be able to successfully do so. But if your bill does pass all of those hurdles, it will become a law. Once I was filming one of these and this kid came up to me and he's like, "Are you a streamer?" And I was like, "No, I'm not a streamer." And he was like, No, you definitely are. I recognize your stream stuff, man. Do you play Rocket League?" And I was like, "I do play Rocket League, but I'm not a streamer." And he's like, "No, I know you." And it turned out that we played soccer together, and that's where he knew me. That's it for part 1. Let's go to Randall's Island and get some book recommendations. The Manhattan 2. What happened to the first one? Today we're on Randall's Ward's Island. Hey, this is my friend Tim Vasco. And Tim, if you had to recommend any book to a student of politics, what would you recommend?
I would recommend Weber's Politics as a Vocation.
Wait, what?
I was thinking about what I was doing. I'd recommend Weber's Politics as a Vocation. I love that lecture because he starts out with a claim that I feel like all professors should make to their students, which is, I'm going to bore you for about the next 45 minutes out of your mind. But at the end of it, you will understand something fundamental about how modern politics work and why there are so many problems with it. So I think that's one text that if you can cultivate the patience for is really worth checking out.
My other friend, Casey, at Fordham. Casey, what would you recommend?
Oh man, I'm not ready with I'm racking
Okay.
my...
Go ahead.
Okay. So the book I'd recommend is The Book of Embraces by Eduardo Galeano. And I think it's a good read for these times. It's like a collection of kind of vignettes, some more prose, some more poetry. Very, just exploring what it means to be human. And it's a good read. And you can read it a few minutes at a time. It's a good companion.
For the second lecture today, back when COVID was first kicking off, my last in-person class in early March, I recorded the whole thing. And that class was on Congress. And so I'm gonna drop that lecture in here, and you get to see what it's like to be in the classroom. And I mean, get the literal information you need, but you'll also get the kind of dynamics and interplay of being in a real class. Watching this again made me nostalgic for what it was like to be in a real physical class, and maybe you'll get the same effect. Okay, good. Okay, good. I gotta go in 4K, so it's gonna be a really nice video. Okay, welcome to day 2 of Congress in the American political system. first, we may as well talk about the logistics of the class. Probably seen my email and the million other emails on the topic, but if you haven't, you should know that most of the major colleges and universities in New York City have suspended classes and switched to online instruction because they don't want their students and faculty to be affected by the deadly epidemic sweeping the globe. CUNY has decided not to do that. Yes. So for now, I am required to keep coming to class. However, if you saw my email, you know that I have changed the attendance policy so that if you choose not to come to class out of just reasonable precaution, just email me and let me know, and those absences will be excused. So you're okay. They won't affect your grade either way. And because I'm going to record the lectures, and then send out questions over email, send out the exam review over email, do a take-home exam, also send out over email, you'll be able to keep up in the class and do everything as you normally would without coming to class, at least for the next few weeks, while this is a reasonable precaution to take. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
So let's say if we don't come, like, you know how we do the discussion?
Yeah.
Instead of like not being here, are we gonna have to like type it up or something or answer it like online?
If it gets to the point where classes are fully suspended, then we'll probably do some type of replacement for discussions. Like you can still submit questions to me via email and I'll still send them out. And then maybe, yeah, you'll have to type like a short response to one question of your choosing or something. And that'll be your substitute for participation. Yeah.
I know we're talking about the exam on Monday, but how exactly are you, I've never done an online exam, so how exactly, is it a PDF? Is it like, how do you actually do
We'll probably just do a very similar version of the exam you would have gotten in class, but it'll be take home. So I'll email out the exam questions, and then you have 24 hours to just write responses, like type up a short essay, and then email it back to me, basically. So that's just a take-home exam format, basically. Does that make sense?
But where do you would post it with? So you would have a section saying
I would just email the actual questions to you guys in a Word document.
Okay.
And then you would read the questions and then just respond in your own Word document.
Type it up anywhere and just send it back to you through email?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Just get by the next day?
Yeah, it would be a 24-hour take-home exam, basically, instead of the 75-minute in-here exam. So, like a Blue Book exam, but you do it at home on your computer, essentially. It would differ because that would kind of by necessity be an open book exam because you'd be at home with your notes and the internet and stuff. So the expectations for like your ability to like know and recall stuff would be higher than an in-class exam where you're doing it without notes or anything like that. But it should even out because you'll have access to the book and your stuff and so forth. Okay, other questions, other concerns? Okay. Today, for the first time, I think ever teaching this class in my illustrious long 1.5 career teaching college classes, no one sent in any questions, which I think was just confusion and potential trepidation about what was going on with school and was it going to be canceled or what was the deal. That's completely fine. We're gonna.
I didn't even know there was this.
Right. But it's okay. I'll just do the regular lecture and we'll go through Article 1, which was the reading. And some of the older versions of the syllabus today is like blank or doesn't have reading or something. Yes.
None of the versions have like March 11th.
Yeah.
Yes. I think the brand new one has it because I looked at it, but it's okay. The reading was Article 1 of the Constitution, which is very short. It's like 5 pages or something. So we're just going to go through that, put it up on the projector, and talk about some interesting features of it. And then we'll probably call it a day. This time, yes.
Are you going to send us the brand new?
Yes, I'll send you the brand new. Okay, other questions? Anything else? Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about. I wonder how the audio is for this video. It's probably really bad. I'm gonna have to get an external mic. I'm gonna become a real vlogger after this. We're gonna talk about this concept called, let's see, iron triangles. Iron triangles. So an iron triangle refers to the basic sort of like policy process by which actual rules get made and enforced. So it's not just, oh, we write these laws and then we follow them to the letter and we're done forever, and that's how lawmaking works. You all know that it's way more complicated than that. And so one of the ways it's complicated is that you have sort of 3 different points of power and leverage that all interact with each other. And these 3 different points are basically the agency that enforces the laws. So let's take our example as sort of environmental regulations. So the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, would be an example of the agency that would enforce the laws around environmental protection. So the agency is in one corner. Then, I'll just write that, an agency. And then the other corner is a congressional committee that has to do with enforcing those same rules and regulations. So a congressional committee. So this would be like Congressional Committee on the Environment, for example. Then the third corner would be the sort of interest groups or the non-governmental organizations that also deal with this issue or have a stake in this issue. It's important to them. So this, for our example of environmental protection, might be like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or an environmental group that wants rivers and waterways to be protected. So this, we can kind of write sort of like NGOs or activist groups down here. So in my example, I'll write Greenpeace. Okay, so this is an iron triangle because these 3 groups or these 3 leverage points, they all work together to determine how policy is made and then how it, even more importantly, how it is actually enforced in the real world, basically. Does this make sense so far? I'm going to explain each corner again. Any questions? Okay, only medium makes sense? That's fair enough. So these 3 basically work together to form laws and rules. So you remember from last class that whenever Congress wants to pass a law, that law has to go through a committee that is specific to what that law is about. So the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Congressional Committee on Protecting the Environment, the Congressional Committee on Veterans Affairs. So that Congressional Committee is one point in the triangle, basically. Remember, that's made up of different representatives and senators who serve in that committee and try to hold hearings and mark up laws that might be written about, say, the environment. That's their job on that committee. Now, once those laws are passed by the Congressional Committee, they have to actually be enforced by a government agency that handles that stuff. So in this case, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, would be enforcing the environmental protection laws passed by Congress, basically. Does that make sense so far? Yes, the agencies have to enforce the laws passed by Congress. And the agencies are under the president, so the president picks the head of the EPA, for example. And then these guys over here are influencing both of these groups all the time. So NGO stands for non-governmental organizations, just people outside of government, basically. So activist groups like Greenpeace are trying to basically influence congressional committees to pass stricter environmental regulations, for example. They would also influence the EPA to try to enforce those regulations as strictly as possible, because that is sort of their motivation. It's their policy goal is to have really strong environmental protections, so they're going to push people to do that. So that is basically the way an iron triangle works, which is a way of kind of producing the actual rules, policy, laws that actually dictate people's actions in real life, essentially. Okay, does that make slightly more sense than before? Okay, we're improving, we're climbing the hill. Okay, any questions about that? Yes?
Maybe I missed what you said, but where exactly does it start?
It all kind of like interacts in a way, because remember from last class, who writes the bills? Lobbyists write the bills.
Right,
Lobbyists, they go down here, right? So in a way, it sort of starts with these non-governmental organizations who might like lobby a congressional committee or people in Congress to introduce a bill they support, and then it goes in committee and maybe it gets passed into a law, maybe it doesn't, and then it gets enforced by the agencies. But it really is this cycle that can kind of go in any direction. Because if a congressional committee passes a lot of people disagree with, they might get pressured by these non-governmental organizations. Or if the EPA is not enforcing the rules the way people think they should, they might get pressured by these non-governmental organizations. So it can really kind of start anywhere. You can draw this triangle any way you want with any kind of point on top or whatever. The important point is that all three of them are just kind of interacting, basically. So if you want to influence policy, if you want to change things, you got to find a way to insert yourself on one of these corners of the iron triangle, basically. You either have to get a job in an agency that enforces the rules, or get elected and become a congressperson or serve on one of their staffs, or join an activist group, a non-governmental organization, try to influence people. Do you guys want another example? Okay, let's do another example. Veterans Affairs is a classic one that's often used in textbooks. So in this example, you would have the Congressional Committee on Veterans Affairs, and those are the people that would handle sort of making the rules for how veterans are treated when they come back from wars. In terms of the agency, you would have the Department of Veterans Affairs, basically. Think of the people who would sort of like run VA hospitals or handle benefits, things like that. And then for the activist groups, the NGOs, you might have the VFA, the Foreign Legion, veterans associations, people who advocate for veterans, rights and benefits in government. That would be the kind of activist groups. So they would try to influence the congressional committees and the agencies who are carrying out the laws passed by the congressional committees. Okay. Other questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
So are they actually able to influence these other the committee and the agency? Because you know how they have to go through like several steps for something to become a law. Mm-hmm. Does that actually help? That idea or that bill to become a law? Because it would probably take like a year or longer for something to get to that process. Mm-hmm. So can it like influence it? Does it actually really help, or does it do little to nothing?
It just kind of complicates the process. So if you are an NGO and you support a specific law, you can actually try to push it through, and you can actually help it pass sooner rather than later, or pass when it would not have passed at all, basically. But in general, congressional committees have to constantly negotiate with the other 2 points of the triangle when they're holding hearings on a law and when they're marking up the law and voting on it, essentially. They have to think, well, is this enforceable by the agencies? How will it be interpreted by the agencies and by the presidency? And oh, by the way, what are all the activists outside yelling at us? What do they want? How can we appease them? The ones who are meeting and calling our office and so forth, and the people who donated to my re-election campaign. What do they want out of this bill? And so in general, this is a way of sort of complicating the simple process of passing a bill. Sometimes it makes it slower, could theoretically make it faster under certain circumstances, but it just generally makes it more complex, and it means there's kind of like more people you have to please in the process, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is an iron triangle. It's a classic thing that always shows up in political science textbooks. I don't know. Someone in the 70s decided we were going to teach it this way, and so I have to teach it this way. But it's just these three interacting points. They all kind of come together to determine what the actual laws and how they will be enforced are in practice. Yes, feel free to take a picture. Okay, if you have any questions on iron triangles, you can still ask them at any point, or just email. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through Article 1 of the Constitution, and we're just going to point out some of the interesting features of it, basically. Section 1, Congress. So Section 1 just says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. This is a classic move that the authors of the Constitution are always doing. Now, it's kind of hard to interpret what exactly this means. It's especially famous when it comes to the executive branch, the presidency, which I believe literally just reads, the executive powers, or the executive authority of the Constitution shall be vested in a president. And you're kind of like, so the executive is the executive? Like, how is that a helpful sentence if I'm trying to interpret that? You get a similar line here. All legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress. That just means the Congress has the power to write laws. That's what legislative powers are here. The Congress is the one that writes the laws. And as we know from last class, there's going to be a Senate and there's going to be a House of Representatives. And it's funny because this is the actual physical text of the Constitution. So whatever is written here word for word is how it works and how it's actually interpreted. So they literally do just set it up this simply. By the way, there's a Senate and a House. Good luck. Next section. The House. This just summarizes what the deal is with the House. We know from the last lecture that the House is proportional, unlike the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators. In the House, it's proportional to your actual population. They say, hey, you got to be 25 years old. We talked about that. You have to have been a citizen for 7 years. And you can't be an inhabitant of that state in which you shall be chosen. I don't know what that one means. Maybe they repealed that later. Let's Google it, actually. No person. You just have to live in the state you represent, which that seems fair, I guess. That's why people are always arguing about whether they have a house in the place where they're running. Okay. This is the famous 3/5 compromise that you hear so much about. So 3/5 of all other persons. So that is the extremely famous, and just straight up excluding Native Americans. So this is the famous 3/5 compromise. People often don't know how this came about, but basically the southern states and the northern states were arguing about how to count population. And the southern states, which had a large population of slaves, wanted to count those people as part of their population because it would give them more power, essentially. The northern states counter-argued and said, yeah, but none of those people can vote, and you yourselves do not think of them as citizens or as full human beings. So it seems like they shouldn't be counted, and your population should be smaller. So they argued about it a bunch, and then someone with a calculator said, what if we just count all slaves in the southern states as 3/5 of a person? And everyone apparently thought that that was fine to put in the Constitution. So it's still there. It was obviously amended by the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, basically took this part out, and now, because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments guaranteed that former slaves counted as full citizens, they would just be counted as full citizens, essentially. But that is the origins of the famous 3/5 compromise that you hear so much about, that basically slaves were counted as 3/5 for purposes of counting population, essentially. This is like the number of representatives you have to have. They said it manually at the time. They were like, New Hampshire gets 3, we're gonna spell choose this way. Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations 1, Connecticut 5, New York 6, Virginia 10. Virginia was the biggest state, as you can see. And then basically as the US population has expanded, the amount of representatives has grown, and the number and proportion changes every 10 years with the new census. So states that lose population actually can lose representatives in the House of Representatives every 10 years. New York is actually likely to lose a seat or 2 because its population has been flat or slightly declining, New York State, relative to faster growing states in the Sun Belt, California, Texas. California and Texas usually add a few every year, or every census. The Senate of the US shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. And then here is a fun thing that we had to go and fix later with an amendment, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years. So the senators, famously, were not directly elected, which is weird because you got to directly elect people. That's just the rule. No, that's not how it worked. The senators were actually chosen by the state legislature of their state. So if we still use this system here in New York, we would not get a vote for Chuck Schumer as senator or whoever we wanted. We would just vote for our local representative in the New York State Assembly, in the New York State Senate, and then they would turn around and pick 2 people they thought would be good senators to go serve in Washington, basically. So we would be like 2 levels removed from actually picking the senators. This got eventually pretty unpopular as the country became more democratic and said that they wanted to have more direct control of these things. And then finally the 17th Amendment instituted direct election of senators. But that wasn't until the early 20th century, actually. It was just over 100 years ago. So there are people alive today who were kids when you couldn't even directly vote yes or no on a senator. The more you know. Oh, and this is what we talked about, how they actually stagger the terms of senators. So as you know, senators serve for 6 years, but they have Senate elections every 2 years. How do they do this? Well, they just pick 1/3 of everyone every 2 years, and so the 6-year terms are staggered essentially. So you're not swapping out the whole Senate every 6 years. You swap out a third of it every 2 years. So you elect about 33 new senators every 2 years essentially, which is smart. It keeps things a little more stable. You got to be 30 to be a senator. You got to be old as a bone to be a senator. You got to be a citizen for 9 years, and you got to live in the state in which you're chosen. Oh, this is important right here. The vice president of the United States shall be president of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. This just means, hey, if there's a tie in the Senate, 50-50, the vice president is the tiebreaker. So he gets to go down there and break the tie, which that's pretty much the only consequential thing the vice president ever gets to do. So I bet that is super exciting for him. I bet he's rooting for 50-50 ties every single election. The Senate shall choose with a U their officers and also a president pro tem in the absence of the vice president, or when he shall exercise the office of president of the United States. You got to pick someone to fill in if the vice president can't break your tie, basically. This is a cool power. The Senate has the sole power, capital P, to try all impeachments. So that means that when the president is impeached, as the president was recently, the trial takes place in the Senate, and the senators actually serve as the jurors for the impeachment trial. It's really all the branches come together. It's very fun. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he's like the judge of the trial. He's the trial judge for it. And then the senators hear the evidence, and they're the jurors, and they vote to convict or to acquit. Yeah, Chief Justice shall preside. No person shall be convicted without concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So you got to get 67 of 100 senators to vote to convict you on impeachment charges if you want to remove the president or whoever is being impeached. It's hard to get 2/3. It's never happened. It probably would have happened with Nixon, but then Nixon resigned like the day before. So he just got out of that one. Let's see. Section 4, the elections for the senators, that just gets set up by the state legislatures. Congress can alter it if they want to. Section 5, powers and duties of Congress. So this is up there as maybe like top 5 most important sections of the Constitution. So this kind of lays out what Congress is actually allowed to do. So they can expel a member with 2/3. Oh wait, I take it back. I think it's section 6 there's a really important section here that says all the stuff they can do. Oh, powers of Congress. That's the one I was thinking of. So almost every sentence of section 8 is famous in the legal tradition. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. So right there, that just sounds like boilerplate, but it's actually like literally foundational for Congress and for the American system. Congress has the power to do taxes, to do tariffs, which are duties and imposts and excises, to pay the debt, provide for the common defense, aka fund the military, and the general welfare of the United States, aka pass spending bills about anything you can kind of think of as long as it relates to the general welfare, which is most things you could potentially think of. They can borrow money, they can regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. They can establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. Remember, all this is very important because at the time, the states were sort of reserving as many rights as they could to themselves, essentially. They didn't want to give up their rights to the federal government. But every single one of these rights, it means that the federal Congress can do it. So when they say, for example, we can establish a uniform rule of naturalization, they just gave the entire control of immigration and naturalization to the federal government over the states. And that is why, to this day, the state of California and the state of Alabama do not have different immigration rules. You do not have to apply to the state of California to emigrate there from, say, Nicaragua. You apply to the United States, then you settle in whichever state you eventually want to. But there aren't different immigration rules to enter different states from foreign countries. The federal government sets the same rule for everyone. Now here is one that we're all pretty thankful for. To coin money, regulate the value thereof. Famously, before the Constitution, the 13 colonies mostly had different currencies. If you went from Pennsylvania to New York, you had to change your money. If you went from Rhode Island to Virginia, you had to change your money. This was a huge pain, and by giving, again, the federal Congress the power to coin money, you guaranteed you would have one currency for essentially everyone in the country, no matter where they were. This saved everyone a lot of headache. Let's see. They also got the power to fix the standards of weights and measures, so that means if we ever want to switch to metric, Congress has to do it. They also, let's see, they can punish counterfeiters, that's cool. To establish the post offices. This is another thing that seems very minor and boring, but it's actually the reason that we have a US post office, but not a New York post office or a California postal service. You have one national postal service because we gave Congress the power to establish post offices. Oh, they can do patents. So the Congress handles the rules around patents. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, aka to set up the court system, essentially. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, that's cool. And offenses against the law of nations. So I guess if you're doing piracy, Congress has to deal with you. You can't do that state by state. This is just slipped in here. To declare war, that's important. To raise and support armies. To provide a navy. They can call forth the militia. Wow, this is a long sentence. I have no idea what this says. They can do something with forts, and it sounds like we don't use that one that much. Every sentence is famous except this sentence. To make all laws which shall be, oh, this is a famous one. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause is interpreted as sort of a catch-all that says, look, if we didn't write something down very specifically that Congress can do here, they can still do it if they need to do it to accomplish something that we said that they could do in this. So, for example, if you have this clause that says, Congress has the power to establish post offices. If to establish post offices, they have to pass additional legislation, like say defining, what the postmaster can do, where the road should be that mail is carried on, how mail carriers should interact when they cross state lines, like whatever it is. They're saying, look, because that is necessary and proper for establishing post offices, it kind of goes under that rubric, then Congress can do all of that stuff because it is required to establish to fulfill the duties that are in this list of things. So it's kind of a catch-all that says if they need to do stuff to accomplish their original goals here, they can do that additional stuff, basically. It's kind of like anything you need to do to carry out your duties, you can also do. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. It took me a while to explain. Section 9, powers denied Congress. Ooh. What can't they do? This is a classic. The writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Habeas corpus, or the right of the body, we talked about a tiny bit, but it's basically says that if you are arrested, you have to be charged with a crime. You cannot just be arrested for no reason. You cannot just be arrested in general. You cannot just be arrested because we want to hold you for a while and see what happens. You have to be charged with a crime. And this goes back actually to English law, when the king, the nobles would famously abuse this by arresting people just kind of to see what would happen, or indefinitely, or because they didn't really like their face. And then they would not charge them with a specific crime under the law. They would just kind of keep them arrested. People didn't like this. They thought it was unfair. And I mean, you all can see why it's unfair. If you get arrested and someone's like, look, we're charging you with littering, and you have to pay the fine or get released or whatever, you're like, okay, fine. But if someone's like, arrests you and you're like, okay, what am I being arrested with? And they're like, they just don't say anything. Or they just tell you to be quiet and they lock you up. Then you're like, well, great, what do I even tell my lawyer? How do I get out of here? When am I gonna see the inside of a courtroom? How do I even know if I'm guilty or innocent? You can't prove your innocence if you're never charged with anything at all. So habeas corpus is a fundamental right of the legal system. It's so important they put it straight in the Constitution and said, Congress, you cannot suspend it, except in cases of rebellion or invasion. Yes, Joanne.
So why aren't they doing anything now? People are getting arrested for no reason nowadays.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So when people are arrested, they are all charged with a crime because of this, basically. Now the question of whether that crime merits holding them in jail indefinitely or something is another question. But all of these people are technically being charged with a crime, so it doesn't violate habeas corpus. The question of whether they're actually getting a, say, speedy and fair trial, which as you'll remember is guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, is sort of another question. And if you wanted to sue under that, then you could definitely kind of like have a lawsuit. But if theoretically, if you were arrested, say like at a protest or something, and you were not charged with anything, and you were just kind of held indefinitely, your lawyer would indeed do basically a habeas corpus petition and say, you have to be released on these grounds. You have to charge the person or release them. That's something you'll sometimes hear in TV shows. They'll say like, look, what are you charging my client with? If you don't have something right now, you gotta let them go, basically. So that's habeas corpus when that happens. Yes?
Okay, so you said they can't suspend, but like say if the crime is like a terrorist crime, they don't have to say anything. Because recently I saw a video of a man who was like held against the wall, and he kept asking like what I'm charged for, but they didn't say anything, and they tackled him and just arrested him. But I was confused that like they never said anything.
Yeah.
So like does it depend the charge you have? Like if it's like a terrorist law or terrorist attack, do they have to stay silent or something? Like they always have to say something? As
a practical matter, when like people are being arrested and they're being like tackled or whatever, the police will not always like immediately like formally say what they are being charged with. They do have to be charged with something if they're going to be arrested, but that can come later essentially. But it's quite common. This is why you'll hear people who are being arrested will often say like, what am I being charged with? They'll often say that over and over again, and often like the like flustered cop will be like, resisting arrest or something, and so like they try to come up with something because they have to charge the person with something to arrest them, basically. So that may be what happened in that case, is that in the moment he wasn't told what he was charged with, but as soon as they had him like in the cell, he had some charge, basically. And there are very general laws like disturbing the peace that you can apply to a lot of different situations. They're often used in those situations. Now, your question, though, about sort of like, I think you said terrorist crimes, basically, does bring up an interesting point, and actually a case where habeas corpus has been effectively suspended, but we just kind of deal with it. And we've talked about this a little bit, but this is in basically the Bush-Obama war on terror years, especially the prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where the US would capture people in places like Afghanistan. They would have some suspicion that the person was involved with the Taliban or international terrorist groups. But they didn't really feel they had enough evidence to bring the person to trial and actually convict them of a crime. But they didn't want to release them because they felt, of course, quite strongly the person would just immediately rejoin the Taliban or something. So they designated them enemy combatants, which is a term that means you're not a citizen of the US, so you don't really get habeas corpus. But you're also not a prisoner of war, so you're not protected by the Geneva Conventions. You're just kind of in this gray zone that we made up called enemy combatant. And we can kind of hold you indefinitely without charging you of a specific crime. And so there are people in Guantanamo Bay who have been sitting there for basically a decade, not charged with any specific crime, just kind of being interrogated off and on, and like maybe they'll get charged one day, maybe they'll get released one day, maybe they'll have a trial, maybe they won't, basically. So this is a case where habeas corpus has been effectively suspended for these people. Yes?
There was something interesting that you mentioned about them not being a citizen, so that doesn't apply to them. Is this in general, if someone is not a citizen, does this not apply to them?
Right. So the question of what parts of the Constitution, basically constitutional protections, apply only to citizens, and then what might apply to like someone visiting the US or to someone who is an immigrant or to someone else, is very complicated. In general, these laws would apply to you even if, say, you were like visiting and were arrested, because they sort of bind the whole legal system, basically. They would apply to you even if you were an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant and you were arrested. You would still need to be charged with a crime, essentially. In this particular case, like these people being arrested being captured in Afghanistan, the presumption is more that they would count as prisoners of war, but by being designated as enemy combatants, because the argument goes, they aren't actually enrolled in an army of a real government that the US is at war with, then the US doesn't have to follow the Geneva Conventions, which are supposed to tell us how to act in wartime, essentially, basically. Okay, other questions, other things. What else we got here? No Oh yeah, bills of attainder and ex post facto laws are kind of neat. So a bill of attainder is when you basically declare a specific person guilty of a thing just by virtue of the law itself. So it's like, most laws say things like, you can't like litter, and if you do, you'll get a $1,000 fine. Or they say you can't do this thing or that thing. So they criminalize an action or a behavior. But what if you had a law that just criminalized a person, right? What if, what if you all just like passed a law that says like, I have to like be put in jail and just like lists my name and says like, this person is guilty and like should be thrown in jail. That is a bill of attainder. When a law does not criminalize a specific action that applies to everyone equally, it literally just says like, this person has to go to jail. So that was, again, a thing the colonists didn't like and a thing they considered unjust. And so you are not allowed to have bills of attainder, basically. You can criminalize specific actions and you can say this person is wanted for a crime, but you cannot just pass a law that says like, Osama bin Laden is a bad guy and, like he has to be arrested. You have to instead be like, well, Osama bin Laden is wanting on existing charges from existing laws because he did bad things, basically. And then ex post facto law is just some fancy Latin for a law that applies to past actions, a law that applies retroactively, basically. So if it has been, say, legal for 100 years to drink alcohol, you can't pass a law that says drinking alcohol is now illegal, and also this law applies retroactively. So if we have proof you were drinking at any time before today, you can be tried and prosecuted. So, if there's like a picture of you drinking from like 2009, like, oh no, like you're gonna get put in jail. You can't pass that kind of law, right? You can't have laws that apply retroactively, ex post facto laws. This says you can't have tariffs on interstate commerce. So if California wants to sell pineapples to Wyoming, you cannot have any kind of tax or tariff on that. There's free trade kind of within the states in the US. You can't privilege the goods of one state over another. You gotta basically treat everyone equally. You can't just steal from the treasury. You actually have to make an appropriation by law and spend the money legally in the budget. That seems like a good rule. And you gotta publish your statements and accounts. You gotta have some basic transparency about what is fair and what you're spending money on. Oh, and this is a good old classic anti-monarchical line. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. This is a big break from Europe. In the US, they're saying we don't do titles of nobility. No dukes, no princes, no kings, no queens. That's just how it goes. Like if you want to run for office, go get a law degree and run for office. But we're not going to do the other thing where you have kind of like a landed aristocracy and dukes and all that. It's not going to happen. You also, this was sort of a controversy in the first year of Trump's presidency, can't accept any gifts, emoluments, office, title, or any kind of whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. So there was some controversy that because Trump owns a bunch of hotels and other things and is often paid by foreign governments to rent out his hotels or for other things, for events, that these are effectively emoluments or gifts from these foreign powers, essentially. And so people are like, oh, we can, impeach him under the emoluments clause. It didn't really go anywhere, but it is there. Powers denied to the states. Powers denied to the states. Any questions so far, by the way? Yes?
I was off, but
yeah.
What does the president do after he's done?
After he's not president anymore? Usually they write a book. They almost always write a book. They have Supreme Court or Secret Service protection for life. So they get some guys in sunglasses to follow them around forever if they want it. I think some of them turn it down because they just don't want to be bothered. Like I think Jimmy Carter is like, I don't care. I'm 1,000 years old. Like I'm just going to build houses for Habitat for Humanity. They give speeches. One president actually went on to serve on the Supreme Court, which is kind of cool. And then one president actually took 4 years or 8 years off and then became president again, which no one has ever done, 2 non-consecutive terms. Oh, Grover Cleveland. I'll delete the part of the video where I said it was Harding. Grover Cleveland served as president. As you can see, he got elected, served from 1885, and then he was like, no, I'm good. And then boom, 4 years later, 1893. So yeah, he was president twice, non-consecutive terms. Makes it hard to count the presidents if you have like, the list of the presidents, because you're like, where do you put Cleveland?
Wasn't he counted twice? I know one president was counted twice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe so. He's the 22nd and 24th president. Which I feel like he's just the 22nd president with a break, but I don't know. I'm not really sure. So that's what the presidents do. Maybe it was when was Harding who became the Supreme Court? Yes?
I know this is like a huge debate, but I don't really know how it works. Showing your taxes, where does that fall?
So it's become a modern tradition for when someone runs for president to demand that they release their tax returns for the last few years, basically. So you can see their financial statements, provides transparency, where their money is going, where their money is coming from, how much they donate to charity, all of that stuff. There is no law that says you have to do it. And indeed, often presidential candidates just won't do it because they don't want to. But more often they will, because it's good politics, it's good press, and it's generally a good tradition to have because it increases transparency for the people running for office. But if you really don't want to do it, there's no law to make you do it, essentially. Yes?
Can a president be impeached but not get removed from office? I'm not sure if I'm getting the right information, but I heard Clinton, he was impeached, but he wasn't removed from office.
Yes, Clinton and Trump, actually. So impeached is just the term for bringing impeachment charges against someone, like starting the trial, basically. It's like being indicted in the criminal court. Being removed from office on charges of impeachment is getting convicted in the Senate, actually getting kicked out of the presidency, basically. So the last two presidents to be impeached had a trial in the Senate, and then the Senate didn't convict them. That's what happened with President Clinton and President Trump, basically. Okay, other questions? Other hands? Section 10. Powers denied to the states. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation with foreign governments. That's basically what the first thing says. You can't print money. You can't pass bills of attainder, ex post facto laws. You can't pass a law impairing the obligation of contract. You can't grant titles of nobility. So you can't do anything the federal government can't do. Also, don't try to print your own money because we have the federal government to do that now. Also, please don't try to enter into a treaty with another country. We have to do that as a group, so don't do that on your own. California cannot enter into a treaty with France. The whole U.S. has to do it. Yes?
Can a state leave the United States? Can they say you no longer want to be part of the United States? Or once they're in, they have to stay?
Yeah, that is a very important question in the history of the U.S. because that was the question of the Civil War, essentially. So the southern states declared themselves seceded from the Union, aka they left, essentially, and then waged a war against the North to try to maintain their independence. They lost that war and they were reabsorbed back into the Union. The general legal interpretation of this is that secession or leaving the Union is actually illegal. You can't actually do it. There's no lawful mechanism for seceding from the U.S. And so the kind of official position of some northern politicians at the time was the South was not its own country. It was just a bunch of states in rebellion that were still within the U.S. And it was lawful for the Union Army to go in and basically suppress that rebellion, essentially. That was how the Civil War was seen in the North by certain people. Whereas the South saw it the other way. They said, we are our own independent country called the Confederate States, and we're being invaded by our neighbor to the north, the United States, in what's basically, this war of aggression, basically, to bring us back in and conquer us, essentially. So whether you think secession is lawful and legal actually really affects how you would interpret, for example, the Civil War on that basis, basically. Yeah, this is all just look, if you're a state, you can't do federal government stuff. You can't keep troops, you can't, enter into treaties with other states and declare war on a third state. You can't engage in war unless you get invaded or you're in imminent danger and you can't get permission from the federal government. Don't try to do your own little taxes on imports and exports. Just let the federal government do that stuff. Yes?
How do sanctuary states work? New York is not a sanctuary state, but it's constantly facing setbacks from like the federal government? Like how does it work?
Yeah, sanctuary city is usually how it's defined. So essentially, sanctuary cities, like New York City, are cities where the local city officials and government are instructed not to share information automatically with immigration enforcement agencies and agents, basically. So there might be, for example, some procedure where if you get arrested in Arizona, they might say automatically check your immigration status and then share that information with ICE, and then ICE can deport you or pick you up or do whatever they want. Some cities have the policy that they will not automatically share that information with ICE. It doesn't mean that they'll like, the NYPD would like link arms to protect you from ICE or anything like that. It's not quite that dramatic. It just mostly means as a bureaucratic measure, they won't share information and make deporting people easier than, it has to be, essentially. Sanctuary city is a little dramatic, basically, yeah.
What about companies?
Sanctuary companies.
Well, not sanctuary companies, but I've heard companies work along with immigration agencies.
Yeah, this is another area where it's sort of like the decision is made company by company and actually school by school. So a lot of colleges and universities have a similar policy as the sanctuary cities. They say, we will not proactively share information with, say, ICE or other immigration enforcement about our students or whatever the case is. Companies can also have those policies to say, we will not proactively cooperate unless they have like a warrant and a court order to share immigration status. But other companies might have, no such scruples and might indeed share, the immigration status of their employees with ICE or others to facilitate deportation.
But doesn't that contradict like the immigration policy for the federal government? Because the federal government has like the same policy in every state. Wouldn't the sanctuary state like go against that?
This is a good question, right? So there's this clause in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause, which just says federal laws, when they conflict with state or local laws, get priority, basically. Federal laws are supreme over state laws. So the question is, if you have a local law that contradicts federal law, like sanctuary cities, or for example, this one is really famous, when a state legalizes marijuana, but the federal government still has it as an illegal drug, what do? Right? When there's like 800 dispensaries in California growing weed and selling it legally, but the DEA is still like busting people for marijuana. Like, how do? Does the DEA raid legal dispensaries in California? Then do like the California State Police like defend the dispensaries from like federal drug agents? Like, how does this work? And it actually does get that messy. So there are like multiple lawsuits about essentially, can the DEA enforce like anti-marijuana laws against legal dispensaries in California? Basically, can sanctuary cities lawfully not cooperate with ICE to a degree? And the honest answer is that it will be resolved in a series of very drawn-out court battles over the next 25 years, because that's just kind of how these things work, basically. But I think one defense for the sanctuary city rationale would be that they are not, as I said earlier, like actively trying to like hide immigrants from ICE or something. They're simply like not automatically sharing information along certain bureaucratic channels that facilitates deportations. So that is maybe more of like a fielder's choice discretion type thing that local law enforcement and governments are allowed to make within the confines of federal law. That would at least be their argument, I think. Now, if you were maybe a lawyer for ICE, and you were like, no, actually, you have to share this information because you have to enforce the federal immigration laws that exist, and you have to act within them, essentially. So it's a genuine argument, it's a good question. That is Article 1 of the Constitution. It lays out the basic structure of the Congress. The Constitution is designed to basically set up each branch of government with its first three articles. So Article 1 says the Congress, the most important branch. We're going to set that one up first. We all just read it together. It was a good day. Article 2 sets up the presidency. It says a lot of the same stuff, but for the president. Article 3 sets up the courts. It says a lot of the same stuff, but for the courts. And then there's some other articles that sort of lay out different procedures for like the way that you would resolve treaties and relations with other states and sort of technical clauses. Then you get to the Bill of Rights and then all the amendments. The Constitution is actually really short. I think it's the shortest written constitution in the world. It's also the oldest of any democratic country. It's quite common for constitutions to be super long and complicated. I think the Indian Constitution is like 700 pages. But the US Constitution is it's like a little pamphlet. It's very easy. You can read the whole thing in like an hour. Okay, so that is Article 1. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe classes will all be canceled by next week, and we'll never see each other again. But I feel like we will. Either way, thank you for a good class. I will see you all in the future.